So, in 2026, a war kicks off that completely redraws the map of the Middle East. What we're going to do here is break down exactly how the conflict between Iran, the US, and Israel all went down. Take a look at this. This is Tehran on February 28th, 2026. What you're seeing is the result of a massive, coordinated strike that just plunged an already volatile region into all-out war. And honestly, it caught pretty much everyone by surprise. Right from the get-go, the stakes were just unbelievably high. This quote right here is from Donald Trump, and it was released just as the first bombs were falling. It's a stark admission of the human cost he knew was coming. And that, of course, brings us to the big question, the one this whole explainer is trying to answer. How on earth did we get here? How did decades of simmering tension, failed diplomacy, and all this internal chaos just boil over into open war? Let's get into it. All right, so the whole thing really ignited with one single massive military operation. The codename? Epic Fury. We're going to look at how this one strike lit the fuse that set the entire region on fire.
So picture this. It's a Saturday morning. President Trump is on Air Force One, and he gives the final go-ahead. And just like that, U.S. and Israeli forces unleash this multi-domain assault. And when I say multi-domain, I mean they hit from everywhere: the air, cyberspace, with missiles, all at the same time, targeting Iran's military and its government. And their number one target? The single most powerful person in Iran, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. He'd been in charge for over 30 years. His compound in Tehran was completely destroyed, and he was killed. I mean, this was a classic decapitation strike. Taking out the head of the regime was a core part of the plan from the very first minute. And this really gives you a sense of the sheer scale of that first wave. We're not talking about a couple of missile strikes here. This was huge. The Israeli Air Force flew its largest combat mission in history. The U.S. used everything from missiles to these new one-way attack drones. And maybe most importantly, a massive cyber attack took down the internet across the country, creating total chaos and making it almost impossible for Iran to coordinate a response. And there was no mystery about the objective. It was laid out pretty explicitly. In a video message, Trump spoke right to the Iranian people, basically telling them, hey, when we're done, your government is yours for the taking. The stated goal was, without a doubt, regime change. Okay, but this whole thing didn't just happen out of the blue, right? To really get why they launched Operation Epic Fury, we've got to rewind a bit. Look at those final, really tense weeks before the war broke out. Yeah, this timeline just lays it all out so clearly. You can see how fast things escalated. It all started with these huge anti-government protests inside Iran, the biggest since the '79 revolution. Then the regime cracks down hard. That's followed by a major U.S. military buildup in the region. And the final piece of the puzzle, the last domino to fall, the collapse of those last-ditch nuclear talks in Oman. That was it. And this part is just wild. In the last few hours before the attack, the world was getting two completely different stories. The mediators in Oman, they thought they had a deal. They were saying peace was within reach. But then you look at Washington, and President Trump is publicly saying he's not happy with the talks at all. Basically, he was signaling that as far as he was concerned, diplomacy was over. And we really can't overstate the scale of the internal crisis that was happening right before the war. That number, 32,000 deaths from the protest crackdowns, that became a huge part of the American justification for going in. It helped them frame the whole thing not just as a strategic move against Iran's nuclear program, but almost as a humanitarian mission. So that was the first punch, but how did Iran respond? Well, that initial assault was absolutely devastating, but this conflict was a long way from being over. Iran hit back, and they did it fast and on a scale nobody was expecting. Just look at this map. It shows you exactly how fast this war spread beyond Iran's borders. Iran's counterattack, which they called Operation True Promise IV, wasn't just aimed at Israel. Nope, they fired hundreds of drones and ballistic missiles at U.S. bases and American allies all across the Middle East. I mean, just look at this list of targets. You've got the Gulf states, you've got Azerbaijan, even a British base over in Cyprus. The message from Iran couldn't have been clearer. If you're hosting U.S. forces, you're now in the line of fire. And just like that, a whole bunch of other countries got dragged right into the fight. And then they hit the world's wallet. By threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz, which, is this tiny choke point where about 20% of the world's oil flows through, Iran made the conflict global. Oil prices shot through the roof, and international trade was thrown into chaos.
Okay, so with Iran hitting back hard, the whole conflict just spiraled into a new, much more chaotic phase. So let's take a look at the fallout, both in what the leaders were saying and, of course, the devastating human cost. So, U.S. officials were being very, very careful with their words. This quote from Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is a perfect example of their messaging. He says, "This is not a so-called regime change war," but then immediately follows it up with, "But the regime sure did change, and the world is better off for it." It's a very particular way of framing things, right? Meanwhile, Israel had its own justification, which was a little different but worked hand in glove with the U.S. message. Their defense minister, Israel Katz, called it a preemptive attack, basically a defensive move to take out threats before they could even become a problem for Israel. This table right here is a perfect illustration of what they call the fog of war. I mean, look at the casualty numbers. They're wildly different depending on who you ask. The U.S. claims very few losses, while Iran is claiming hundreds of American casualties. It just goes to show how hard it is to get the real story in the middle of a huge conflict.
And the chaos didn't stop there. The conflict also lit a fire on another front. Iran's most powerful ally in the region, Hezbollah, started firing missiles into Israel to avenge Khamenei's death. And of course, that immediately triggered Israeli strikes back into Lebanon, and a very fragile ceasefire there was just shattered to pieces.
So that brings us to where things are right now. A week into this war, the future of Iran, and really the entire region, is completely up in the air.
So to quickly recap where things stand, first, you've got a massive leadership vacuum in Iran. It's being run by a temporary three-person council. Second, the war is very much active. Strikes and counterstrikes are still happening. Third, the global economy is feeling the pain from all this disruption. And finally, the rest of the world is scrambling. The UK is hunkering down, while other countries are just desperately calling for everyone to come to the table.
And that really leaves us with the one question that hangs over all of this. These strikes shattered a political order that had been in place for nearly 50 years. But what's going to replace it? That's the great unknown. What exactly is going to rise from the ashes of the 2026 Iran war?